things. But before that, what we need to exactly know is that, what mainly causes inflation, right? Now, think about this. The first factor that we'll discuss is known as demand pull inflation, right? Now, I gave you this analogy yesterday, that think of a single product first, right? Now, think of a single product that we have discussed in our microeconomic classes. There is a product which has a demand to it, which has a supply for it, right? When the demand for the product increases, what would that do? For the same quantity that is available to be sold, there are more people who are willing to buy it. Now, market forces will bid up the price, which means the product will become expensive. So only people who can now afford that more expensive product will be able to buy. Other people will obviously not be able to buy. So similarly, think about it. If you think of the entire country as a whole, then there is total demand for all goods and services, which is made up of, which is made through all the different citizens that live in that country. And then there's total output that is being produced by different firms and companies located in that country, right? Now, if demand side is increasing faster than the supply sides, right? So there are more people demanding more goods and services, that will cause demand pull inflation, right? So I'll give you an exact definition, but before that, let's quickly look at the graph for this, right? So on the y-axis, you have GPL. What is this? General price level. This is macroeconomic equilibrium graph that we have been looking at again and again while we were discussing GDP, and now when we're discussing inflation, right? On the x-axis, you have real GDP, right? Downward sloping is your aggregate demand, upward sloping is your aggregate supply, right? Wherever the two intersect, that is your macroeconomic equilibrium. And what it shows is that how much will be your general price level, GPL, right? And how much will be your real GDP. Okay, is everyone clear on this, students? Any confusion so far? And how much will be the real GDP? Okay, if aggregate demand is increasing, that will cause a rightward shift in the curve, right? A rightward shift in aggregate demand shows that aggregate demand has increased. And by now we should be absolutely clear on what causes an increase in aggregate demand. We know the 5 components of aggregate demand, which are consumption, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports, right? So if any of these components is increasing, except for imports, because imports is coming with a negative sign. So imports is not even included in the aggregate demand of an economy, because this is not the spending on locally produced goods. This is the spending on foreign produced goods, right? Okay, now this being said, right? Okay, let's move on and let's talk about it more. Okay, now there could be a couple of reasons why aggregate demand is increasing. Let's discuss few, right? If country's population is increasing, right? So think about this, that Pakistan's population growth rate is relatively high compared to other countries, right? So every year there are more people in the country, which means that there is more need for food, there's more need for clothes, there's more need for housing and all these different things, right? So that increases aggregate demand, right? And you can see that even though there would be an extension in aggregate supply, because you'll move from point A to point B, so there is extension in aggregate supply, but in the process, that will result in higher prices in the economy. Any confusion so far? Students, is this making sense? Higher prices in the economy, right? Similarly, population could be one reason. Then other reasons for increase in aggregate demand could simply be that there is more demand for exports, right? So now more of your resources are spent on producing exports. Again, aggregate demand increases. That means higher prices. Government might be spending more. In infrastructure, healthcare, education, and things like that, right? So if any of the components of aggregate demand increase, that means higher aggregate demand and higher prices. Okay. Now, on the other hand, there's another factor that causes inflation, and that is cost push inflation. Now, what is cost push inflation? Cost push inflation, as the word suggests, is when the cost of production in a country is increasing, right? And what causes this cost push inflation? Let's talk about this, right? Now, first thing that we know from our discussion about aggregate supply, that whenever the cost of production is increasing in a country, that causes a leftward shift in your aggregate supply. Do you agree? Right? So higher cost of production causes a leftward shift in aggregate supply, right? So have a look at this. So downward sloping is your aggregate, upward sloping is your aggregate supply, downward sloping is your aggregate demand. When cost of production increases, since that reduces the profits for producers, that reduces their incentives to produce. So they'll want to produce less at every price level, right? That's why when cost of production increases, overall supply in the economy or aggregate supply of the economy decreases. Okay. Now you can see for yourself, previously where the original aggregate supply and aggregate demand were equal, that was your equilibrium point, and the y-axis showed you the general price level, initial general price level. Now where the new aggregate supply is intersecting with your aggregate demand, which is this point, that is where your new equilibrium will be. And that is at a higher general price level. That's at a higher general price level. Is it making sense? Students, are we good? Okay. This is cost push inflation. That's how we show cost push inflation on the graph. What factors can cause cost push inflation? If, let's say, a country is using imported raw material, right? Let's say Pakistan has a lot of dependency on imported fuel. And often our exchange rate is becoming weaker, like what's the case right now. So our exchange rate is weaker and we are importing from all these different countries, USA, I guess, Saudi and things, countries like these, we are importing oil. So every unit of oil costs us more, right? So it should be no surprise for you to, understand that previously, sometime back, our exchange rate used to be $1 equals 100 rupees, right? But now it's as low as $1 buys 170 rupees or something, right? Now, just imagine, looking from our point of view, previously we used to give 100 rupees to buy goods worth $1. So let's say if 1 liter of fuel is worth $1 in USA, just giving you a very simple example, right? So back in the day, we used to give 100 rupees out of our pocket to buy 1 liter of fuel. Now we are paying 170 rupees out of our pockets to buy 1 liter of fuel. Yes or no? So weaker exchange rate makes your import expensive, and therefore this is known as imported. Sometimes this is also known as imported inflation, because you are buying more expensive imported raw material, right? So this is also known as imported inflation. Any confusion about this, right? Imported inflation. We good? Okay. Now, this being said, okay, great, perfect. Then it's not just that cost push inflation is always imported, like it's always, due to more expensive raw materials. It could also be due to rising prices in the local economy. So for instance, if let's say, wages are increasing, and let's say the rent prices are increasing, or electricity is becoming more expensive, or any major cost component is becoming expensive, that will also result in cost push inflation. Is it making sense, students? Right? Okay. Now, this being said, there's an other factor that cause inflation, which is not very common nowadays, but it was present back in the day. And I'll tell you what that is. So we have talked about two causes of inflation so far: demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. The third cause of inflation is monetary inflation. Now, let me tell you what this monetary inflation is. Now, you have to listen to this carefully. Technically, what happens when there's inflation taking place, we say that goods are becoming more expensive, right? Why? Because the money that we are using to buy those goods, now we have to give more money to buy fewer goods. Think about this again, right? So money inflation is basically things becoming more expensive. Or in other words, we have to pay more units of currency notes, more units of currency to buy the same quantity. Yes or no? That's what inflation is. So in a way, it's when more money is chasing fewer goods. When more money is chasing fewer goods, that's when inflation is, right? Is making sense? students, or is it confusing, right? So let me explain this point again, right? So goods are becoming expensive, meaning that more units are needed. Okay, think about this. Previously, something was worth 100 rupees. Got it? Now that same product is worth 120 rupees, right? Now, if you look at this, technically what's happening, that the product is the same, but it's only that we are now giving more units of currency, right? To buy that same good. To buy that same good, we are giving more units of currency. Previously, it was just 100 rupee note. Now it's 100 rupee and 20 rupee note. Is this clear up till now? So in a way, right, money value is decreased. Yeah, that is the point where I was trying to bring your attention to, right? Money is losing its value. So either you can say, right, prices of goods have increased. This is one way of looking at inflation, right? Another way of looking at inflation is that the value of money has decreased. Now the same unit of currency would buy you fewer goods, right? Is making sense, right? So if you look at from the goods point of view, it's you need, if you look at the goods point of view, things have become expensive. So the price has increased. If you look from the money perspective, now you have to pay more money to buy the same quantity, right? So in other words, money has lost its value, right? So monetary inflation, students, are you getting? So monetary inflation happens when more money is chasing fewer goods. Where more money is chasing fewer goods. Or let me explain this through a much easier and intuitive example. Let's assume, who prints currency notes in any country? Who prints currency notes? Who prints currency notes in Pakistan? Who has the authority, right? The central bank. In every economy, it's the central bank that prints currency notes, right? And you might know this, you might not know this, that technically there is no constraint on the central bank. Yeah, that is called State Bank of Pakistan. In our case, it's known State Bank as State Bank of Pakistan. In other countries, the names of central banks are slightly different. In USA, it's called Federal Reserve. That is their state bank. That is their central bank, right? And so on, right? So what I was saying here is that there is no restriction on any country's central bank as to how much currency should it print. Did you guys know this? I repeat myself. There is no restriction on any country's central bank by any authority or institution whatsoever as to how much the currency notes should it print. So technically, Pakistan's State Bank of Pakistan, Central Bank of Pakistan, is free to print as much currency as much it wants to, right? And if our central bank prints a lot of currency, then there will be more money chasing fewer goods, right? So people have more money lying in their pockets, whereas the quantity of goods and services is the same. Now, in such a situation, what will that do? Right, exactly. They will not want to do this one. That's absolutely correct. But in the past, there has been examples where countries printed a lot of money, not realizing that it will just cause inflation and that will not directly benefit the country, right? I mean, so if the solution to poverty would have been as simple as printing more currency, right? Then I'm sure all countries would have gotten out of that problem, but that's not like that, right? So when you print more currency and more currency becomes available to people, then they start demanding more products, right? They go to shop, but the quantity of the goods is the same. Now, all together, more money has started chasing fewer goods. When producers get to find out that people are willing to pay more, but they don't have enough products lying in their shop, so what they will do is they'll bid up the prices. They'll bid up the prices, right? Exactly. 1 trillion note. Why? Because Zimbabwe did this. Zimbabwe is an example. Germany is an example, but Germany did it quite some time ago. That happened in Germany during World War, when Germany, it was before your European Union, it was before euros, right? So when they printed insane amounts of currency notes, and that resulted in hyperinflation. So this is hyperinflation when, the rate of inflation is in millions of, or, thousands of percentage, right? So hyperinflation is a very high rate of inflation when it is as high as, um, 1,000 percentage points and things like that, right? So one bread used to cost, I don't know how many millions of marks. I think marks was the currency in Germany before euros, and so this is the idea, right? So hyperinflation is when the inflation rate is so high that um, it's that you like literally needs millions and billions of currency notes to buy one small thing. More than trillion, yeah, exactly, right? And Germany, Zimbabwe, these are some examples of economies where they did suffer from hyperinflation only because of the reason that their central banks printed so many currency notes. Right? Are we getting this, students? Right? Okay. Now coming back to the idea. So if more currency starts chasing, more money starts chasing fewer goods and services, obviously that will result in inflation. Right? How many of you got this? Right? So that is known as monetary inflation. Right? And that can only happen, right, when the central bank prints too much notes, right? And therefore more money starts chasing fewer goods. Chasing fewer goods, causing the prices to bid up. Fewer goods and services, causing prices to bid up. Okay, is everyone clear on this? Okay, so let's do a quick recap to bid up, right? Okay, let's do a quick recap and then move forward, right? So we started a discussion about, started our lecture with a definition of what is inflation, right? There might be a reason. How can they make such decision to print more notes? Okay, now think about this. Okay, I'll answer that question. I'll quickly answer that question, right? So let's do a quick recap, and then towards the end of that, I'll answer your question, Johan. So what is what is inflation? Inflation is persistent increase in general price level. What is general price level? Average prices for goods and services. So average price level, right? So it's not just the price of one good or selective goods, it's average price level, right? Across the board for all goods and services, right? And what persistent means constant, right? Without any fluctuation, right? So it's constantly rising. As I gave you this example yesterday, that if you record the prices of certain goods, then at the start of the period, the prices will be relatively low. At the end of the period, the prices will be higher. Then in the next period, after 1 month or 6 months, the prices will be even higher, and so on and so forth, right? So it's constantly increasing, right? Okay, now this being said, then I said that there are three causes of inflation: demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and monetary inflation. Now, the idea of demand pull inflation is fairly simple. If for some reason aggregate demand is increasing and your aggregate supply is at the same level, right? Your aggregate supply is not changing and your aggregate demand is increasing, then obviously that will result in higher general price level. That will result in higher general price level. Now, one thing to notice here, now students, think about this. This will get even more severe. Demand pull inflation will get even severe if the economy is operating in if the economy is operating in long run, right? Because what's the shape of the long run aggregate supply? Do you remember? So the shape of long run aggregate supply is a straight vertical line. Now you can see for yourself, if an economy is in its long run, which means that an economy is already fully utilizing its resources. If an economy is fully utilizing its resources, that means that there are no spare resources to produce more, right? And therefore, any increase in aggregate demand will only result higher inflation, but no increase in the GDP. Because, I mean, how will you produce more when you don't have any spare resources, right? So your GDP is staying fixed at the same level where it was previously, because there are no spare resources to employ and to increase your output. But since people are demanding more and the supply is fixed, what will that do? That will result in higher prices. Now, if you compare this long run situation with the short run, in the short run, at least there was a little bit increase in the GDP due to higher aggregate demand. Students, did you notice or not? In the short run, at least there was some increase in the GDP because you also moved a little right on the x-axis. Moving right on the x-axis meant that your GDP did increase. But in the case of long run, it will not increase even a bit, given the fact that an economy is already fully utilizing its resources, which means it's already operating on its production possibility curve. All resources are fully employed. So you can't hire more resources to produce more. Easy? Is this simple? Okay. Now, the other factor that causes inflation is cost push inflation. Now, cost push inflation is basically when the cost of production is increasing, and that could be because of a lot of different reasons. One being, import inflation, when the cost of imported raw material is increasing, right? One reason of imported inflation could be weaker exchange rate. I did tell you, right? If your country's exchange rate is becoming weaker, that means now you have to give more units of your currency to buy the same units of foreign currency, meaning imported goods are becoming expensive for you, right? Right. But then cost push inflation can also happen due to your locally produced raw material or goods becoming more expensive, cost increasing in your home country, like rent is increasing, electricity prices are increasing, fuel prices are increasing, and so on and so forth, right? So when cost of production increases, that causes a leftward shift in aggregate supply. When that happens, you can see for yourself that your general price level will rise from GPL1 to GPL2, right? But what happened in the cost push inflation? Your GDP also decreased. Did you notice, students, that previously you were operating at you were producing a higher GDP level, while now with aggregate supply shifting to the left, which means that there is lesser output being produced, right? The country's GDP, the total value of goods and services, will also decrease. At least in the case of demand pull inflation, the GDP was increasing. In the case of cost push inflation, the GDP decreases. Is this making sense, students? Any confusion so far? Zohan, Fizil, is this making sense? Okay. Now, the third and the last cause of inflation is monetary inflation. I did tell you that it's not very common nowadays, given the fact that central banks have become more aware of the fact that just printing more currency notes will not help in any way, right? So they always print a calculated amount of currency notes, just as much the need is, right? And in our A2 economics syllabus, we will even study that how do countries determine the need? How do central banks determine that how much is the need for printing more currency, right? And then what rule they follow to determine how much more currency to be printed, right? But in the past, since central banks were not that aware, or perhaps they didn't realize this, that printing more currency could be dangerous, and what they did, they printed more currency, and as the result, more money supply became available in the economy to buy the same quantity of goods and services. Now, when people get more money in their pockets, right, they go to the shops, they start demanding more. So just imagine if tomorrow morning somehow my bank account balance doubles, I will feel wealthy. What will I do? I'll start demanding more goods. I can now even afford things that I was previously not able to. So what would I want to do? Buy more goods. I go to shops, but the products are the same. Like it's the same quantity of products available in the markets. So when I demand more and everyone else is demanding more, producers get to find out that there's more demand, supply is the same. So they will bid up the prices. They'll increase the prices, right? Causing inflation. Easy. Now, your question, Zuhan, was, okay, how can they make such decision to print more notes? Okay, now in A2, we'll study about that why central banks print more currency notes. And I mean, you do need to print more currency notes, right? Now, just a small example I'll give, and that I hope will help you understand this point, that think about this. The quantity of goods and services is also increasing. So in an economy during a certain time period, its GDP is also increasing. Are you getting me? Now, when the GDP is increasing, which means more goods and services are being produced, then technically that country needs more currency notes to buy those more goods. Are you getting me? What's the purpose of money? The purpose of money is to buy goods and services, right? So if there is more output being produced, then to buy that more output, citizens do need more currency notes. Yes or no? Right? Right? So that is why central banks do need to print more currency over time, but that is only in proportion to how much more GDP is being produced. That's only in proportion of how much more GDP is being produced. Is it making sense? So let me write down this concept for you to remember. Right? So central banks should print currency notes in proportion of increase in economy's output, which is its GDP. Output, which is its GDP, right? Is this simple? Okay, because if this is not followed and more currency is being printed more than what the GDP increases, then that will result in more money chasing fewer goods and ultimately resulting in higher prices, inflation, to like make poverty less. I mean, Zuhan, perhaps to some extent, I mean, but this is not what any country would do, right? So perhaps in that case, what the government can do is to print more currency and then give it only to the poor people, right? But then how will government decide how much should each person get? And the government is doing a couple of these things, right? So government can do, but I mean, there would still be a mechanism around that, right? So with more currency that is being printed, then the government can, do things like, for instance, income support programs and all that, right? But at the end of the day, the government has to make sure that it's also in accordance to the increase in GDP, right? So if every year Pakistan's GDP, let's put it down like this, right? So if every year Pakistan's GDP is increasing by $100 million, let's say, I'm giving you an example. So every year Pakistan's GDP is increasing by $100 million, right? So then the max amount of currency notes, the max amount of additional currency notes that the government can print is $100 million, right? And therefore, you can just imagine that even if government spends all of this money on poor people, like in income support programs, that would not be enough to completely eradicate poverty, at least in Pakistan. Not sure about other countries, right? Are you getting me? I mean, that definitely that will make some difference, but I mean, right? Are you getting me? So that's the idea here. And then obviously this is not the only cause that the government has to spend money on. Government has to build infrastructure. Government has to do other things. And how much is the tax revenue? how much is the tax revenue government is getting? That will also determine that, right? How much income support programs can government provide? Because if tax amount is healthy and there is decent amount of tax being collected, then obviously government can afford to spend more on income support programs and charity projects. But if that is not the case, then government really has to be careful where it's spending its money on, right? So that's the idea. Easy, students? Is everyone clear on this? Okay, now we will just move a little forward and we'll talk about how is inflation calculated. We'll not be able to complete all of this um, in today's class, but that will just give us some, flavor of how is inflation calculated. Now, students, think about this. The calculation of inflation is a long process, right? I mean, which is, I would not say complicated. It's a lengthy process, right? And there is certain amount of information, there's certain information that is needed. So technically, what is basically inflation? So the change in prices, as I gave you the example the other day. So what was the price of certain basket of goods, right? What was the price of certain basket of goods? Now, when I say basket of goods, I mean, let's say, what are the things that a typical consumer buys, right? So a typical consumer buys, what could be a good example? So a typical consumer buys food items, spends on electricity, pays for education, pays for healthcare, things like that, right? Now, if I list down all these different products, right? Let's say, what was the price of product X at the start of the period? That is X1. What was the price of this product at the end of the period? X2. That, and this period could be anything, right? 6 months, 1 year, because we can calculate inflation during different time periods. Similarly, what was the price of product Y at the start of the period? Let's label it as Y1. What was the price of this product at the end of the period? Let's say Y2, right? What was the price of the product at the start of the period? Z1. What was the price of the product at the end of the period? Z2, and so on and so forth, right? Got it? But obviously, when we are calculating inflation for an economy, it's not just the three products, because what exactly do we need to capture? So in a way, what we are looking at when we say inflation, that means rise in the cost of living. So another way to define inflation could be rise in the cost of living, right? Because who is being affected? A consumer, right? So a typical consumer is being affected due to inflation. So how much is the rise in the cost of living? That is what inflation is, right? Now, to calculate inflation, you need to record changes in the prices of all the products that affect a typical consumer, right? Let me write it down like this. And to accurately capture increase in the cost of living, the economists should record changes in prices for all the products that a typical consumer spends on. Easy? Any confusion about this? Okay, now this being said, right, have a look at this. So what is inflation? Inflation is the rise in the cost of living, right? Or persistent increase in the general price level. But what does that affect, right? Right, we're still, it's not that we have changed the definition of inflation compared to what we said at the start of the lecture. No. Still, let's start with the same definition. What is inflation? Inflation is the persistent increase in the general price level. Now, when general price level is increasing, this means goods on average are becoming expensive. Simple. So when that is happening, to buy the same quantity of goods, people have to spend more money, So the cost of living is getting expensive. So simply speaking, if previously I used to afford my fuel and my rent and my electricity with 50,000 rupees, and now I have to give 70,000 rupees to buy the same quantity, not more, same quantity, right? So my cost of living has increased. Previously, I needed 50,000 rupees to spend a month. Now I need 70,000 rupees to spend my month, right? So my cost of living has increased. Now to capture inflation, which means to calculate inflation, and to accurately capture increase in the cost of living, the economist should record changes in prices for all products, that a typical consumer spends on, right? So what are all the products that a typical consumer spends on? That is what will capture inflation, right? Is making sense? So yet tomorrow we'll talk about that, how is inflation calculated, but this is the gist of it, that you record the prices at the start of the period, you record the prices at the end of the period, you see how much is the percentage change, you do some calculations. Obviously there are some calculations involved. We will look at it in more detail tomorrow, and then we will come up with the final figure, like 5% or 6% or 7%, which shows that this is how much was the increase in the average prices of goods and services during that time, right? Is this good? Okay, so students, will stop here for today, and I'll see you tomorrow at the same time. So take care and have a good night. Bye.